Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition in the Export to Japan podcast. I'm Steve Crane, and we bring you these podcasts in conjunction with the British Embassy in Tokyo. Now, there are many unique differences when we look at doing business in Japan, many different aspects of the business culture that are different, and many things we need to explore and understand. And one of those areas that I know very well from personal experience is when it comes to recruiting and hiring your local staff in the Japanese market. That whole world of recruitment, HR, employment law, there are many similarities between the UK and Japan, but there also are some unique differences too. And that's going to be the topic of today's discussion. And to help us understand more about that, I'd like to welcome our special guest today, Mr. Hiroshi Chiba, who is managing partner of the Uchisaiwaicho Law Firm based in Tokyo, Japan. Chiba-san, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here like this. I'm so honored to be here.
Oh, it's our pleasure. And thank you for making your time available.
Mm-hmm.
So to kick off, there are many questions I'd like to ask you and lots of things I'd like to discuss. But I think to set the tone for this discussion, the first question I'd like to put to you relates to an expression that I picked up many years ago when I first started working in the Japanese market. And it was this expression of job for life that I heard about, sort of related to Japanese employment and the way Japanese employees think. Could you tell us a little bit more about this expression and what it may mean to sort of employees and employers in Japan, please?
Mm-hmm. I see. Traditionally, Japan has been said to have a so-called lifetime employment system. From the worker's point of view, once a worker is hired by a company, he or she usually continue to work there until retirement. It was not so easy for them to find another job. On the other hand, from the viewpoint of companies, it was very difficult for employers to dismiss workers. Workers are very strongly protected by laws such as the Labor Standards Act in Japan. As a result, the Japanese labor market lacked fluidity, and it was common for workers to be employed by one company for a long period of time.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think we've immediately set a good format for continuing this discussion, because there's no doubt that kind of principle and that way of thinking is very different between Japan and the UK and other international markets, for example, where career-wise, people do tend to move on from companies and jobs on a regular basis. It's not uncommon every couple of years for somebody to move to a new company and then another new company, and so there is a big difference there, and that's a very good thing for us to explore with further questions. Before I dive into those further questions, though, one thing I would like to ask you is, do you have any view on whether that principle is kind of changing in Japan at all? As the younger generation are coming into the workplace, are they still keeping that same thought process of this kind of job for life, long-term employment, or do you start to see any changes in the way younger generations are thinking about their employment these days?
I think it depends, but watching the situation of the younger generation, I believe it is changing significantly. As you know, Japan has suffered from a sluggish economy for almost 3 decades, so long. So some people call it the lost 30 years. During that time, some companies went bankrupt, and even if they didn't go that far, some companies fell into financial difficulties and had to restructure. In many cases, working conditions were changed unfavorably for the workers. Young employers who grew up in such a situation have seen their seniors who have worked so hard for the company, but in the end, they were not rewarded. So there is a widespread feeling that loyalty to a particular company does not pay. It does not guarantee a bright future for them. So that's why an increasing number of young people are quitting the companies shortly after joining. The challenge for companies is how to keep good quality workers, especially young workers. On the other hand, there has been no significant change in the worker protection from a legal perspective. And it remains very difficult, for example, to dismiss a worker.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the topics that I want to come on to and understand a little bit more. So I will be asking you some more questions on that in a moment. But that's a very interesting observation you've just shared with us about the trend and the change and some of the reasons why that change is happening. And I would say that what you're now seeing, that trend for the younger generation, is probably part of the thought process, over here in the UK and European and US markets. A lot of individuals feel that they can sort of accelerate their career development by changing jobs in order to get the promotions and work their way up in terms of responsibility. So that might be a little bit of what is beginning to come into the Japanese market in the way that you're seeing now. So it's very interesting to see that trend. But anyway, so moving on, so you sort of mentioned that there are some differences out there and things to be aware of, and let's sort of move into that a little bit. So a lot of the audience for our podcasts that will be listening into this discussion will be international companies from all over the world who are considering to go into the Japanese market and maybe establish some form of entity in Japan, a local presence, and think about recruiting and hiring their first local staff in Japan. So for companies in that situation that are thinking to take that step for the first time, are there any particular aspects of employment law or any sort of local processes that they should be thinking about and working on from your experience before they go ahead with that plan? Any advice or tips you can give them?
Okay. Though I don't want to focus on the negative aspect, but first, I'd like to say that there is a particular characteristic in the Japanese law, which can be dealt with fairly properly with some proper knowledge, I think. But I'd like to elaborate on the characteristics first. And the Japanese law is very protective of workers, and it is very difficult to force a worker to quit, dismiss them, even if they have some problems. Apart from special cases such as serious breach of a work order, it is better to think that it is almost impossible to dismiss a worker. Employment mobility remains low in the sense that it is not easy to end a contract from the company's side. In conclusion, it is important to bear in mind that it is not possible to dismiss a worker easily after hiring him or her with only a simple check, and then if the person cannot do the job properly. So what I want to say is the check at the first moment of the labor contract would be much more important. If you pay good attention to them at that moment, there would be a better future, I think.
Yes, that's very, very wise advice. And certainly from my experience, I set up my first company in Japan over 20 years ago and started recruiting a team in Japan at that time. And I completely understand the points you're making. Now let's just break some of this down a little bit. So the first thing I'd like to check with you is with regard to an employment contract. So you will know very well in here in the UK and other international markets, it's very common practice and good practice to have an employment contract between the employee and the employer. What advice should we give international companies that are looking to come into the market and employ their first Japanese staff? Should there be an employment contract in Japanese? Does it need to relate to Japanese employment law? And is this the sort of thing that you and your company can help international companies with?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think the initial working conditions in the contract are very important. So usually they are made in Japanese. Of course, it can be made in English as well. But in most cases, as far as I know, the contract can be made in Japanese if the worker is a Japanese. And there are some regulations by the Japanese law. So being clear about the working conditions, especially about the working hours or wages and so on, such conditions should be clarified at the beginning of the contract. As you know, Japanese attitudes are sometimes vague and difficult to understand. They may not ask you openly about such conditions, but being vague is no good. So clarifying what your working conditions are and so on would be very important and effective, I think.
Yes, that makes perfect sense, and again, I would agree with that very, very clearly. And I think it's an area where international companies or foreign companies should definitely get local advice on those employment contracts when they're coming into the market for the first time. And certainly from my experience, I would reflect on a few points you've made there. And I would advise any companies listening into this podcast today that are thinking to enter the Japanese market and start to hire people there. The first thing I would always say is make sure that your decision to enter the market and have a local presence and hire local staff is the right one, because it's not the kind of thing that is very easy to unpick if you make a mistake. If it's the wrong timing or not the right, the right thing to do, it's not an easy thing. First of all, it's not an easy thing to set up and do. And secondly, it's very difficult to unpick it if you feel that you've made a mistake. So in terms of your strategy for entering the market, make sure that it is the right time and the right decision to do. Have some form of confidence that the market opportunity is there. Maybe build your business before you set up your own office with a partner or an agent or a distributor. Get some confidence, get yourselves a customer base, make sure that you're confident that you can have a long-term secure future in Japan before you even consider hiring. And then secondly, when you get to the point of doing your recruitment process and finding your right candidates, again, take your time and do it properly, and really do everything you can to make sure as much as possible that you're hiring exactly the right staff member and there's a good connection and good understanding and good communication, and avoid any kind of mistakes in your recruitment process. I know in many foreign cultures, there can be more of an attitude of, I'll hire somebody and we'll work together. And if it works out and everything's good, we carry on. But if it doesn't work out, we just choose to say goodbye and we work something out and we move on separately. And, right, I'm not saying it's better or worse, right or wrong. It's just a different way of thinking. But that's certainly not the mentality for Japan. And I think that theme is certainly coming out from this discussion that we're having. So make sure you put the time and the effort to get that recruitment process right and get the right candidate. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's really important to spend the time to get that right. So, and then of course, when you get to that point, get the right contract in place, make sure you understand the dynamics of that and reach out and get some good advice on that. Okay, let's imagine we have to touch on a difficult topic, but it's important that we bring this topic up. If there is a scenario where a foreign company has an employee in Japan, and for some reason there is some challenge or some problem, something is not working out well in the relationship or in the work or the expectations or whatever. Now, I understand exactly. You made it very clear a little earlier that it's not the kind of culture and it's not easy to dismiss people or let people go. You made that message very clear, and that was very good advice. But what is the kind of process, or what are the next steps for a foreign company if it ever gets to that situation? What options are available for them, and what should they do if there starts to become a problem with an employee in Japan in some way?
Thank you for a great question. I think it is very important when we want to understand the Japanese culture. As you say, it is important to pay sufficient attention at the recruitment stage. I can't overestimate the importance of it. However, problems may arise after recruitment, of course. And if things do get complicated, it is not easy to get them to leave the company. But on the other hand, I think this is the important part. On the other hand, given the recent trend of young workers quitting companies easily, you have to think about overcoming problems and securing competent personnel. So as a lawyer, I have seen so many troubles. And in many cases, there usually is a kind of critical moment when, if they had dealt with the problem properly, it would not have been a big problem like that. It is important to nip problems at their early stage. For example, when workers show signs of dissatisfaction or when small problems arise, I think the bosses or the managers should listen to them carefully, or try to understand the workers' conditions and situation. I mean, what I want to say is a specific area of importance is communication. Miscommunication tends to occur, especially in the relationship between supervisors and subordinates of different ages. It is important to openly ask about thoughts and feelings without thinking like, I don't have to say he is such a thing, and so on. Understanding each other is difficult, even among Japanese people. So I think it is very important to talk each other in order to understand each other across cultural barriers. So that's why I believe good communication can be a solution for such difficulties in the working place.
Very, very good advice. Yeah, and I think that advice clearly applies so relevantly in Japan, but of course it's also relevant anywhere in the world to follow that kind of process. But it's very, very good advice to give with Japan. And I think I would just expand on that from my perspective to add a few additional thoughts to that. One of the challenges for foreign companies to think about when it comes to this particular point is building that relationship and having that good communication with your local staff in Japan can often be a challenge because of things like time zone differences. You know, it's not just a language and a cultural issue, but there's also time zone differences too. You know, there can be a very small window, for example, between Europe and Japan. There's only a very small window of 1 or 2 hours per day when there is an overlap in the working day time zone. And it can be very easy when we're also busy to not find the time and make the time to keep regular contact with your staff and your employees in an international market like Japan. But as we're hearing, it is really important to do that. Don't fall into that trap of thinking your team over in Japan, everything is running smoothly, everybody's happy because you're not hearing too much from them, everything is good. You know, that is a dangerous trap to fall into. We have to be very proactive in making time to regularly keep in touch and keep that good communication. And therefore, just as you were explaining very clearly to us, if a little problem or situation does start to occur, you can be aware of it immediately and kind of nip it in the bud and deal with it exactly as you were explaining. So really important to think that through as part of your strategy is making that good communication. The second point I would make, again, from my experience of this, is there is another big issue relating to thinking about your first employee in Japan. Often international companies will hire one person on the ground in Japan first as a kind of general manager who will slowly grow and build the business. And when you have that kind of strategy, of course, the relationship with that individual is really important at first. But then as your business starts to grow and you start to hire a team, if that team is sitting below that manager and they are reporting to that manager, then obviously the communication and the local management is the responsibility of this manager. But again, you have to work out from the head office in the international territory, how do you handle that situation? Not only is it important to have the relationship with the manager in Japan, but also somehow you have to be a little bit aware of what's happening with the team in Japan, without disrupting the seniority of the manager. And it's a difficult thing to do, but again, very, very important to get right. So there's a few thoughts that I would just add to this discussion for foreign companies to think about as they enter the market and build their team in Japan. There was a couple of little questions that just came to my mind. I just want to jump around a couple of specific questions actually that I suddenly thought about that I think will be valuable. Just taking a step back to talking about the employment contracts and the employment law in Japan. Does Japan have what we refer to as a kind of a trial period when you hire somebody new? Is there a period of time that might be 1 month or 3 months or 6 months or something where it's a kind of a trial period before the full terms and conditions of the employment contracts kick in? Or does that not exist? Is it from day one that it's kind of a full relationship and a full contract? I just wanted to ask you that question, please.
Okay. Whether you set such terms depends on the situation, and it can be different from company to company. Some companies put or set such terms at the beginning of the contract. But according to the precedents by the court, even in such terms, a kind of labor contract is already signed. So it has already begun. So dismissing such a newbie at the end of the beginning term, trial term you mentioned, can be a little difficult, just like in the case of dismissal. So you have to be careful in choosing such a decision. So what I want to say is it depends whether you set such a term at the beginning of the contract. But basically, even if you set such a contract, the protection for the employees similar in many aspects.
Yeah, but very clear. Okay, thank you. So in other words, don't depend on thinking you have some loophole or some escape mechanism. The same thought process should apply from day one. Yeah, okay, that's very clear. The other question I wanted to ask you was when we spoke about, in the event of some difficulty cropping up and the good communication that's required and nipping problems in the bud early and things like that, what tends to be the situation in Japan regarding more formal appraisals and things? Should there be regular formal meetings, maybe with some minutes and an agenda and a structure, some sort of appraisal process on a regular interval with employees in Japan? Does the labor law require things like that?
Regarding the labor law in Japan, they don't require such aspects. But of course, recognition from the management side can be very encouraging or pleasing for the workers. So it can better the atmosphere in the work field, or sometimes it can change the total aspect of a certain worker accordingly. But I think the Japanese are difficult to understand in such aspects because some people like to be praised openly, but others not. So I think the managers should recognize and sometimes distinguish whether the person in front of you who is a person who likes to be praised openly or the one who is not. So if you understand the characters of the workers and you choose a proper way of appraisal, it will be a great drive for the company to improve the atmosphere in the company.
Understood. That's great advice. So it's really a management technique in a way to work out how to motivate the employees on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, very clear. Very clear. Thank you. Now, you spoke a little bit and gave us some great advice on, the whole thing about communication and nipping any potential problems in the bud early and things like that. But I just want to push you a little bit on this. What happens in a very rare worst case scenario if it gets to a problem where an employer feels it's almost impossible to correct a situation with an employee? So hopefully it never happens, and I'm sure it only happens very, very rarely. But if it ever got to that position, what then tends to happen over in Japan? What would be the process or the next steps, or is there anything that can happen when it gets to that point?
Well, to tell the truth, it can be serious sometimes, but unfortunately, there are many such examples in the past. For example, if a problem arises because of poor performance or lack of cooperation, and if the company dismisses the employee easily without taking sufficient action, it often leads to litigation, of course. And in litigation, as I mentioned earlier, dismissals are very rarely approved. So if possible, we lawyers try to acquire or reach some kind of amicable settlement in the process. If we can do that, it's kind of ideal. Of course, the company have to pay some money, usually 6 months salary to 12 months salary and so on. But if the amicable settlement is not acquired, after a lengthy litigation process, the company loses the case and the employer is forced to, employer's lawyer is forced to pay the wages during that time. And then the worker comes back unashamedly. This can be a nightmare. So going on the worst scenario should be avoided as much as they can. Of course, it's a matter of course, but there are some cases when we can get amicable settlement, as I said. We would have to seek for such a kind of target in that case.
Yes, understood. So really everything is pointing back to the earlier points in this discussion of get that recruitment right and manage it well and deal with any problems, be aware of any problems that may be coming up and deal with those at an early stage so that you don't even get to this kind of situation is the best way to deal with this, quite frankly.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. In terms of one other topic I wanted to ask, in terms of local employment of staff in Japan, are there any particular terms and conditions that are typical in Japan when recruiting local staff? So, for example, I know I was aware when we've hired some people out there are things like sometimes the employer pays the commuting allowance for the staff to get to the office or the work location. There are sort of traditional bonus schemes in Japan and things like that. Are those fairly common practice, things like that? And are there any others that foreign companies should be aware of regarding employment in Japan?
Okay. In this aspect, I don't think there are great difference between ours and those in other countries. But as I have said, the Japanese attitude is sometimes very vague, ambiguous. which can be a cause of troubles afterwards. So clarifying the detailed working conditions can be effective and very useful. Regarding the viewpoint of law, the law requires that the main working conditions must be clearly stated in writing when concluding a labor contract. In particular, to clarify the details regarding wages would be very important. It includes handling of premium wages in the event of long working hours, or as you mentioned, whether commuting expenses will be paid, and if so, whether there is a maximum limit, and so on. And besides that, working hours should also be clarified, including start and finish times and rest periods, and so on. So try to be specific and try to be to make the situation clarified would be very important, though it may be too simple as an advice.
Understood. Okay, very good advice. Thank you. Now, we've given a very good overview and a very good summary of some of the differences that foreign companies should think about when they're hiring their people in Japan. And you've shared with us some great insights into some of the key things to get right and to think about. I certainly know from my experience that Japanese employees, tend to have this great reputation for being very loyal to their company, incredibly hardworking, having strong commitment to their job and their company. I've seen the benefit of that myself with team members that we've hired in Japan. What is your view on that as a sort of from a Japanese person's cultural point of view? What are your thoughts and view on that from your experience?
Traditionally, that was very true. But on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, young workers' attitudes towards work and the company are changing. So unconditional loyalty cannot be expected from such young workers, I think. If they are not convinced, they may quit immediately. However, this does not mean that such commitment cannot be expected. We can expect in some cases, increasingly, young people are more concerned about whether they are satisfied with the work, with the task they are engaged in, whether they can make use of their ability, and whether they are recognized, rather than whether they are treated well. So in this sense, I think it's very important to improve communication with employees, especially with younger employees, and to understand where each individual feels valued. Understanding such a kind of characteristics of the younger generation, the company would be able to make full use of the young workers' competency and ability at full length. That's my impression nowadays.
Very good. Yes. And I would just confirm that's exactly my experience, exactly how you've summarized it there. I think it's very important to think about it as a two-way process. And I think if an employer and a company treats the local staff well, and of course this doesn't just apply in Japan, of course this is all over the world, but we're focusing on Japan for this discussion. If you treat your employees well and make them feel valued and give them challenging work that they're enjoying and feeling stimulated by, and they feel rewarded and recognized, not just financially rewarded, but rewarded in terms of their contribution to the goal of the company. I think there's an obligation on an employer's point of view to treat your team that way. But if you're able to do that, then absolutely, I think that loyalty comes back, and it's kind of a two-way process, isn't it? And I think that's the important part from your message you just gave there. It's not a one-way process where an employer should think, well, I'm paying your salary, so you should give me that loyalty back. You have to think a little bit more deeply than that, don't you? So I think, again, that's very, very good advice you've given us there. And I would certainly say from my perspective, I've had a very good experience with employing people in Japan. I think in total, with the various companies that I've set up and I've been involved in, we've recruited over 40 Japanese staff members, and my experience has been very good in terms of loyalty and commitment and hard work. But I have invested heavily in getting that recruitment right, and in supporting them and listening and communicating and building the relationship. That's one of the other key points I think that we've got out from this discussion. No, it's been a really, really good discussion, and I think we've pretty much covered all the topics. There was one final one, actually. I'm just looking at my notes. There was one other thing that I just did want to ask you, and I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm still going to ask you to get your opinion, because I think it's important that we bring this message out. Mm-hmm. Does Japanese employment law, and if it ever gets to one of those worst case scenarios where things get a little bit difficult, on the Japan side, is there any leeway at all or any flexibility, considering it's a foreign company employing people in Japan? Or does the employment law in Japan just treat it all the same, whether it's a Japanese company employing or a foreign company? Is there any leeway or changes in that? I think it's an important point that we should make clear to our audience.
Mm-hmm. Basically, the Japanese law deals with companies are the same, regardless of the nationality of the companies. So I hope the knowledge about the Japanese law and Japanese habits in the field of law or labor law can be helpful for many companies coming to Japan from abroad. So that's why I have been willing to be here to talk about this topic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I think you've answered exactly what I thought you would answer, but I think it's very important, because I do hear that from companies that talk to me about entering the Japanese market. They can sometimes have a mindset of thinking, well, we're a foreign company and we'll pretend we didn't quite know what the law was, and we're not experienced in things. But unfortunately, that doesn't wash. It's your responsibility to find out how the law works and to work with the local laws. And this discussion has been very, very helpful in giving some very, very good insights into that. So I wanted to make sure that we made that point very clearly. But it's been a really, really good discussion, Chiba-san. And I think, sort of in summary, my sort of conclusions from this discussion are, first of all, make sure you've got your strategy right as a company. And if you are considering to set up an entity in Japan and hire people locally, just make sure that you're doing that at the right time and the conditions and the circumstances are right, because it needs to be a very long-term investment. You cannot just dip your toe in, and if you're not happy, step out very quickly. That's not the right approach. So first of all, make sure your strategic decision, the timing is right, and the circumstances are right. Then from that point, when you start to do your recruitment, get that right. Invest time, invest energy, get to the best candidates, talk to the best candidates, interview them thoroughly. Make sure it's a two-way process where you're not just interviewing them, hear their voice, hear their questions. Make sure you get that recruitment right, and you offer the position or positions to the right candidates on a long-term basis. And then once you get them on board, it was very clear, the message we've had here about managing it well, building the relationship, keeping in touch, listening, create an environment where your local staff in Japan feel they can talk and can mention things, and they will be listened to in the right way, so that you can really build that strong communication and relationship, and make sure that if anything is not quite working out in the way you expect it to, which it probably will, as we know in business, it never goes smoothly. There will always be bumps in the road, but you need to have an environment where those bumps in the road come up and can be discussed and can be addressed. Don't let them get swept under the carpet and not addressed, because that's when problems can occur. So create that good relationship. And if problems do occur, when those bumps in the road do come, deal with them, talk about it, work out the solution, work together with your local team members on finding a kind of win-win solution, so that you can navigate through it. And that will obviously build your relationship even stronger. And really important to take time to learn those cultural differences and different business practices. And this is a good insight, listening to podcasts like this to help you learn that. And And finally, make sure you're very aware of some of those complexities of the Japanese employment process. We've touched on it a little bit with Chiba-san's help today, but certainly if any companies out there that are thinking to take that step into Japan, if you want that further help and advice and legal help, then feel free to reach out to Chiba-san, and I'm sure he would be happy to help advise and guide you through those processes so that you get it right as much as possible. On that topic, if any of you do have any questions for Chiba-san, obviously you can look him up via his company's website. I think a lot of that is in Japanese, so it may not be so easy, but an easier route might be just send your questions or your inquiries to us at Export to Japan through our website or through our email address, info@exporttojapan.co.uk, and we will be very happy to forward your questions on to Chiba-san, and he will come back to you in due course. So feel free to reach out that way as well. Well, it's been a great discussion, and I think that finally just leaves me to thank you, Chiba-san, for giving us your really valuable time today and your great insights. I think we've learned an awful lot from your experience and your wisdom, and I think it will be very beneficial to many of our listeners to help steer them to make the right decisions and the right plans as they enter the Japanese market. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for this precious opportunity for me as well. I'm looking forward to support a lot of people who watched this podcast. Thank you very much.
So I hope that's been a good discussion for everyone listening in to this podcast. I hope you found that really interesting, and certainly the wisdoms that Chiba-san has shared with us, I think, have been incredibly valuable. Feel free to reach out to us at Export to Japan, or reach out if you want to reach out to Chiba-san, send your message to us, as I explained. And please, think carefully, take those steps correctly. If you're looking to hire in Japan and start your business there, think about some of the wisdoms of this discussion today. And by the way, keep looking out on the Export to Japan channel, because we have more exciting podcasts like this coming up. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Chiba-san, and we'll catch you all again very soon. Bye now.